and essentially says that when you're regulating housing, that decision criteria need to be clear and objective, and we're very aware of that requirement. One of the things that's a little bit different in one of the conversations we've had in this rulemaking as we've moved along is we started out our first draft for the regulations for climate-friendly areas were pretty prescriptive. They were clear and objective, and we heard quite clearly from local governments, gee, we'd like more flexibility. We built in an alternative path for that. And so we're trying to hit the right balance between saying these are the standards and allowing local governments some leeway in terms of determining their standards. And that is the critical issue. As I understand it, and Steve Shipsey might jump in to correct me here, but as I understand it, the rules themselves that we develop, as long as they provide direction to local governments in terms of what the outcomes should be, and they allow flexibility for local governments to develop clear and objective criteria that are consistent with the rules, that's where the rubber hits the road on the clear and objective criteria. And so where we're writing a rule that would directly apply to development, you're absolutely right. That needs to be written in clear and objective terms. Where we're providing more general direction as to development codes, there's some flexibility for local governments. And we, of course, fully expect that local governments are aware of the clear and objective standards requirement and would write their actual regulations to do so. In terms of the requirement to build up versus out, I think one thing that's really important, and it's very complicated to explain, is that the way the proposed rules will operate, it is not would not operate in a way to restrict land supply for housing needs. So we have needed to write these rules to operate within the current statutory framework for how cities plan for addressing their residential needs. And generally, that process says we look back at recent development activity, we figure out generally what our land needs are, and then we base our future land need assumptions on that production. And that system will continue to apply. What we're doing with climate-friendly areas is not requiring development in these areas. What we're doing is requiring cities to plan for capacity to allow certain levels of development in those areas. But the construct is not to conflict with the need for local governments to meet all residential needs. So that might be, as you mentioned, manufactured home parks in other parts of the city. Climate-friendly areas are going to be higher, density, mixed-use areas, and those two things aren't going to operate in the same physical space, and one should not preclude the other. And I guess the other thing I would add is just that much of what we're doing here is to try to reduce regulatory barriers. In other words, to allow more use types to be allowed in zones, to allow more development than might otherwise be allowed. And so that, I guess I would say, is the general thrust of the program. Hopefully that made sense.
Yeah, no, I think hopefully it did, and just would ask sort of Eric if you had any kind of final refinements. RAC member Jeremy Rogers, Ted, and let me just jot you guys down here. Jeremy, Ted, and Damien are also in queue. And for those of you, it probably includes me, that doesn't have your affiliation on, go ahead and, if you don't mind, putting your affiliation, your jurisdictions on. It just helps us track kind of geography and know where you're coming from a geographic perspective. Some are coming from a statewide perspective or an organization. Please feel free to add that. I guess, Kevin, the only thing that, so I think you touched on sort of the promulgating bill, and that we're certainly operating within statute. The approach to writing rules so that local governments could write clear and objective standards, not getting in the way of that. You talked about sort of the approach to reduce regulatory barriers and increase housing supply actually within climate-friendly areas. I guess I'd ask you to come back and describe, if you could, what you described for me the other day about the relationship of climate-friendly areas and urban growth boundary expansion. And the other note I would make about manufactured home parks is I would like to maybe just talk for a moment about people with very low incomes. So people with very low incomes, I think everyone on this call knows, and most of you are more expert in your realms and fields than me. I'm a generalist, but have had a chance to work with OHCS on a number of initiatives and work on, housing land supply back when I was in the private sector. So I know some things, but certainly not the depth which this collective body, gathering knows. But the, manufactured home parks are typically serving the most very low income members of our communities. And I'd like to make sure that we're talking about serving those community members and also keep in mind the traditional forms that have been offered or, reduce the sort of the only choice sometimes have been manufactured home parks. And many of those are sort of grandfathered in and existing today that I think any of us would agree are less than humane conditions for community members. And there's also needed housing for community members that are homeless. So DLCD is mindful of the entire spectrum of needed housing as well as housing for, executives and that end of the housing market tends to be able to take care of itself because it requires less subsidy. But we are mindful of the need to work with Oregon Housing and Community Services and are on helping to make sure that local governments have a range of tools and supports to provide as much affordable housing in climate-friendly areas and other areas of opportunity as possible. So that is a very big and long subject. That's not the purpose of today, but one in which I'm particularly fascinated. I know there's a few experts on the call today that think a lot about fair housing. So maybe that's another kind of future focused discussion, whether it's, between the two hearings or not. That is something that the agency cares very much about. I know the commission cares very much about that. So, rather than say, I wouldn't say we're disallowing any particular form within a CFA. One could have a manufactured home park and also, a more compact building that has a greater number of homes right next to it. So we're not trying to dictate form, but we do see the need to allow for sort of on a moral ethical level as well as a statutory level to allow for needed housing throughout the city. And particularly the objective is to have also within climate friendly areas to increase our the equitable outcomes that have been driving the project. So sorry for talking so much there. Kevin, could you explain the relationship between designated CFAs and UGB expansion? I'll also give Eric a chance to kind of see if we got to his questions. And then I know we have Jeremy, Ted, and Damon in queue. Please, Kevin.
You bet. Happy to do that. So yeah, I think there has been a little bit of confusion in looking at the rules, and the rules have evolved over time in concerns that so there's a requirement in the draft rule that essentially says when affected local governments go to expand their urban growth boundaries based on identified residential needs, they concurrently will need to zone additional areas, additional climate-friendly areas. The perception that I'm hearing from people is, well, you're requiring half of our housing to go in climate-friendly areas. That's not actually accurate. Essentially, the way this works is cities will do their housing needs analysis based on identified housing needs. They may come up with results that say, gosh, we need more medium and low density residential. They're going to look at the densities that they're achieving within those zones. And if they've adopted efficiency measures to make efficient use of lands within their current UGB, then they can bring forward a proposal to expand that urban growth boundary and to meet those needs. If those needs are different from the type of housing that would be expected in a climate-friendly area, we would actually see a local government doing two things. It would expand the UGB to meet those identified housing needs elsewhere. It would also identify additional climate-friendly areas. And that 50% number is the zoned capacity, so the average buildable residential area within the climate-friendly area. So it is a different formula, if you will, than the formula that's used to address residential land needs under statute. We're basically trying to chart a course to the future we want to see. Our goal is to have, over time, to see at least 30% of housing units in climate-friendly areas. And this is a way to ensure that local governments will grow more efficiently over time. But it doesn't preclude meeting housing needs elsewhere in the city, as identified in the housing needs analysis, and going through that process that's been in use for decades now for cities to expand their UGBs.
Thank you, Kevin. And again, this will sort of be diagrammed for commission tomorrow. Sort of, I need it explained really graphically and simply to me, sort of in cartoon. So I've asked Kevin that whether it's, using Word and Excel or blocks or a photograph or a diagram on a sheet of paper, we hope to sort of diagram that for commission tomorrow and then put that out with our sort of FAQs and materials on the website. Because I know this has been it's not an easy point to kind of get, but the goal is to increase capacity along with UGB expansion, not be punitive against urban growth boundary expansions. Eric, would you like to come on and see if that sort of got at your question, or if there's any follow-up we need to do?
Oh, I definitely appreciate the time and the explanation. I absolutely understand your position. I have some ongoing concerns about, even if the intent is not to increase regulatory costs, some of the vehicle per mile travel rules may in effect get there. But I also know a lot of other people want to talk and don't want to monopolize the meeting. And I really do appreciate you sharing your position on that.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think, and likewise, I think, this may be something Jeremy is about to speak to. We know we want to be review and monitoring this over time very carefully. It is our last intent to raise housing costs and increase unaffordability and decrease equity. That is contrary to our intent. So we do plan to monitor and evaluate the effects regularly and be reporting to kind of ourselves, the community and commission in the short term. Within, we've been discussing every 2 years, for example, but kind of open to other solutions there. Please, Mr. Rogers.
Thank you so much. And Kristen and Kevin, thank you for the explanations that you gave there. And I also want to say, we really appreciate the evolution on those UGB expansion rules over time in the rulemaking process. But I have a couple of more technical things on that piece, but that's not where I wanted to focus my comment here. Sure. And this isn't on clear and objective standards, but is on the needed housing issue. Is that, well, I understand where the rules are going on the UGB expansions and making sure that jurisdiction can still expand their UGB to accommodate the types and affordability of housing that they actually need. If we're requiring minimum density levels inside CFAs, and the CFAs have to be significant enough to accommodate 30% of needed housing, whether or not that materializes, but to at least plan for 30% of needed housing, you're asking cities to perhaps achieve minimum density requirements that aren't really realistic for them, and therefore there could be just less development that occurs, or requiring them based on the type of unit. And Eric was talking about the affordability of the types of units that might be included in the CFA. That affordability profile might not match the community. And so it just seems to me, and it seems to me that these are things that could be figured out through analysis. I mean, the department's already working closely with Echo Northwest and other consultants on the House Bill 2003 work. There's been so much effort and work by so many people on this group here and the department to really get to the bottom of housing needs and housing production, and the approach that we need to take in our land use planning to actually be able to achieve the types of housing at the affordability levels that we need. And here we're coming in and asking that 30% of housing be built in areas at density levels that may not be realistic for the production or the affordability profile. And we're not doing the analysis to figure that out. And I keep bringing this up, and I just don't understand why we can't analyze these issues, see how they would actually likely play out on the ground in the affected communities, about the ability to achieve those density levels, the types and affordability of units that would likely occur in those areas and with the regulations that are proposed, and determine if that's the outcome that we want, and then tweak the rules accordingly to make sure they actually work. Because why would we want to create these areas if they're not going to work for the housing profile of what the community needs? And then the community is going to have to take you up on that on those urban growth boundary expansion changes that you put in the rules. Why would we want to do that? I mean, we don't want to encourage UGB expansions to meet needed housing. Let's create the rules in the CFAs so they actually are more likely to achieve the needed housing.
Yep.
So that's my big concern that I keep coming back to. And I just would ask, could we please bring in the consultants that we're already working with on 2003, analyze this to see how it's going to play out and tweak accordingly so it lines up with our housing need efforts around 2003. And then rather than pushing it to the local governments to do all of this work to go then maybe figure out the same answer to the answer to the question that we could have figured out now, lost a ton of time on our housing production goals. So thank you very much for listening to my concerns.
Yeah, no, Jeremy, thank you. And mostly just going to try and be active listening mode. I know so many of us have had this training and sort of we're all taking sort of mad notes and listening. Jeremy, thank you. And I'm still pondering, like, how could these rules make less development occur? I'm just not sure about that. And maybe we'll just go through the queue and kind of talk about it again and again, because we want to make sure that these rules don't cause less development to occur. That's certainly not the outcome or the objective we're looking for, or the charge from our commission. The year of, you kind of got to at the end of your remarks there, Jeremy, the year of study that jurisdictions will be doing with technical support resources. So with those financial resources you're mentioning, that locally based analysis you're talking about, because I think you'd agree with me, every community's profile, every community's socioeconomic profile and demographic and market is highly unique. So it is within that first year. So I have to keep continuing to log on my phone here to see the queue. That is the intent of that first year of study of definition of CFAs, is to get under the hood and unpack some of these dynamics. Whether or not we do study now, Jeremy, I'm just not sure that it would be, sort of informative enough. But I think the localized analysis as we go through this first year of designation and that monitoring program is essential. We can just all say here today that, we will be continuing to provide 20-year land supply of needed housing within communities together, and the CFAs is a function to help reduce greenhouse gases within certain areas, but it is not meant to impede development in any way, shape, or form. So I just want you to know our commitment there, and that we want to continue to strategize and discuss these issues. And so thank you. And that's probably the best answer I have right now, without saying, we don't have permission from our director or our commission to extend the timeline much right now, but we do hear, and we have heard your request, in your recommendation. So plan B is to do it localized, so that local communities get that benefit of actually participating in their own study and defining their own CFAs and strategies. And then if we're not able to kind of promulgate meaningful research at this stage.
And if I could jump in too, Jeremy, I'm glad you raised this issue. And, to be clear, we've heard this loud and clear in a lot of jurisdictions. Our earlier draft of the rules basically set, building heights and density goals based on population size. And we heard loud and clear from some communities, we're really not seeing development at that level. And for that reason, the latest draft of the rules does allow more flexibility for those larger local governments to basically, the current version says, yeah, you do need to designate a primary CFA to meet, certain more aspirational goals in terms of building height, densities. But for other CFAs, because local governments can designate one or many CFAs or climate-friendly areas to meet these standards, they can pick other less intensive standards for those. So if their communities are looking at sort of nodal development or neighborhood-oriented kind of mixed uses, there's an ability to do a more nuanced kind of climate-friendly area, to establish standards for climate-friendly areas that are deemed to be more appropriate for the local context. There is no requirement for market studies at this time. I think it's likely some local governments will do that. Based on time and resources, we haven't been able to do that in all of the regions that we're looking at, all 7 regions.
Good point, Kevin. Thank you for the clarification. We are, I think folks have probably heard that DLCB staff are talking with the councils of governments about providing technical support to the jurisdictions for the designation of the CFA period. And Kevin, thanks for the clarification that doesn't, each of those probably won't afford a $40,000 to $50,000 economic analysis nested in each of those as well, as much as we'd like it. But we do need to kind of, I think this through and provide some guidance here as we can to local governments. The legislature gave us money for local governments. So we try to stay very true to that, since they are the funder, and that the grant should go to the local government. So we don't really have kind of a level to peel off and say, hey, let's do some market analysis at this juncture. Not to say that we couldn't, but we do follow what the legislature says that we should do with our funds. So not to say that anything's impossible at all, and other, the collaborations are certainly welcome as well. But Kevin, thanks for the clarification. Okay, we should go. The queue is Ted from Jackson County, I believe. Yep. And then Damien, Al, and then Mary Kyle. Please, Ted.
Thanks for the time to talk. I want to start this off with, wow, what a task you had to put together to do all this. So don't take any comments that I have not realizing the monumental task that you had to do all this. But a couple things, I'd like to go back to Eric's point about building up. There's practical concerns to that are not addressed. So we have this 22-acre chunks of land. Well, down here in Southern Oregon, there's sandstone issues, there's high water tables, there are ancient landslides, there are all things that if they're going to either be put within the city or within the UGB, they're going to limit how much of that area that can be used. And I realize there's open space areas and stuff like that that have to be included, but it is going to condense everything into one area. And the only way that you're going to get that density is to go up. It may not be viable to even build on that. So a couple points there is if that kind of housing was already something that was profitable, with the housing shortage that we have, the builders would be building it already. And the fact that we have these geotechnical issues is going to force the cost to go up even more if they build it. Most likely what's going to happen is you can designate these areas, but they're just not going to get built. Couple other points. I don't want to dominate the time either, but
all right, you still have plenty, Ted, please.
Okay, so as far as the UGBs, it's the cities can designate a CFA in an existing UGB as I read it. And I'm not sure how that works. I mean, first from the practical issue, if they designate a CFA and it's still under county control, under county zoning, I don't see how you're going to get the density there anyway. No. And like in Jackson County, we have 9 urban growth management agreements, all a little bit different. We'd probably need to alter those. And I'm not sure how that would even work. So some clarity on how that would work if it's designated and it's still within county control is definitely needed. And then the last point, I have many, but the last point that I'll state here is it says that it's only within the urban growth boundaries from the CFAs as far as I read. But the things like the EV parking, the parking standards, the pet-friendly communities, they all seem to still apply to urban areas. And down here in the county, we have White City, which is an unincorporated urban area. And I'm glad to see, because I don't think White City would be a good candidate for climate-friendly areas, but I guess I want clarity on that. All those other standards, the parking and the EV and the pet-friendly, now apply to White City, which is outside the urban growth boundary. And I'll leave it at that. That's enough for now.
Yeah. No, hopefully you can come back around if we we have enough time today. And tomorrow, of course, we have a similar drop-in session plan 9 to 11. I think tomorrow, maybe it's also 9 to 11:30. Several of us will be at commission, but the core members of the core team, I'll be at commission. Chair McCarthy will be at commission, but Steve Shipsey will be at commission. But your core planning team and the writers and the project managers and all the support staff and specialists on the climate friendly team will be on the phone tomorrow. So please do feel free to come back if you feel.
I'm sorry, Kirsten, just to clarify, that's on Friday, not tomorrow.
Not tomorrow. That's right. Tomorrow we're actually at commission with this agenda item. Thank you, Kevin.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, so back to Ted. So who would like to probably we'll go with your easiest one first, Ted, which was your last one. Your first one, just to, again, sort of diagram it, and we're, these really help inform our frequently asked questions. So, thank you everyone for speaking up and sharing your questions and concerns and the good written testimony once provided. But the concern about how to, where to build, Ted, you described it perfectly. It's a highly localized decision, full stop. It has to be on the ground analysis from the community. And there's no one answer. Your second point about kind of may just be zoned capacity and not produced, that's kind of the stuff we just have to monitor. And that's obviously not the city's, we're all public servants here. We're not, well, not everybody, but we're not developers. So we can't, we can only do what we can do as planners. I would call folks' attention, there's a lot more we know now because of 2001 and 2003 about intensification and compact communities and liberalizing codes, or allowing for development, multi-generational development, et cetera. Also, just kind of point folks, if you wouldn't have otherwise caught it, tomorrow, I think it's tomorrow, Sarah, maybe you can come on and let me know. In commission, we have updates to kind of the division that implements House Bill 2003. And I'm just looking for what day that is coming up, because there's a host of housing production strategies that are coming up for renewal at the commission, as well as a new schedule. And a few cities have crested 10,000 people. I think it's in the morning tomorrow, but there's a variety, 80 tools, I kid you not, for local governments to contemplate vis-a-vis your profiles about to produce housing. So if anyone's gone through that full list of 80, we'd like to hear from you, or our housing team would like to hear from you. But there's a lot more that we know, I think, as a community about what tools can we offer in the public sector to help incentivize, and also, getting codes out of the way as a primary step. So that's part of what we're doing here. But your point is well taken. It just may not be built. And then I think you have two subsequent kind of points and questions there, Ted. One was, how to alter a UGMA if we're designated CFAs at the edge, if you will. And I know Josh is on the phone, so maybe he could follow up with you on that, Ted. Just sort of brainstorm through that together with Kevin as needed. And then Kevin, if you could come on and answer, someone could come on and answer, maybe that would describe the application of the transportation planning rule requirements in unincorporated areas. Thank you.
Yeah, so this is Bill Holmstrom. I've spoken, Ted, with one of your colleagues at Jackson County before about the White City issue. It's, as far as I know, the only urban unincorporated community within a metropolitan area in the state that's outside of an urban growth boundary. The way we've written the rules is really aimed at urban areas within urban growth boundaries. So White City wouldn't have to have a transportation system plan that met these updated requirements. It's an unincorporated, it's not within an urban growth boundary. I think your other concern was about those interface areas that are unincorporated but within an urban growth boundary. And you're right, I'm a former county planner, and there's as many different ways to handle how those areas are planned than there are cities with urban growth boundaries. So we've tried as much as possible to provide flexibility for local governments and counties, for cities and counties to work together to make the planning in those urban areas work. But any place where we need to sand off some edges, happy to work with you on that for sure.
Thanks, Bill. I'll just jump in and say I'm glad you identified the issue on urban growth boundaries. Just to be clear, by and large, CFAs, climate-friendly areas, would be designated within city limits. That's generally where city infrastructure is available. There are a few instances where we have areas under county jurisdiction where a full slew of urban services is available. And in those instances, if there's no expectation that those areas would be annexed into the city, the county might actually identify climate-friendly areas. I don't believe that is the case for Jackson County. So typically, the land would be brought into city limits and then designated as a CFA. I will say this is an issue that I'm working on in our next draft of rules because I recognize more clarity is needed on this question.
Thanks, you guys. Thank you so much. And Ted, thank you. Damien, thanks for waiting in line. Please.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. I have two questions on CFAs. The first has to do with meeting our housing needs in CFAs. And this may seem like an obvious question, but I need to ask it so I can understand it myself. When we're looking at the 30% of our needed housing unit capacity in CFAs, am I correct then that we are then looking at allocating the remainder of that need, the 70%, to areas inside our UGB and looking at efficiency measures before expansion? Second question deals with mix of housing. So as we're looking at CFAs, I think what the goal for a more dense, compact, mixed use part of our city is that we're luckily looking at multi-story, multifamily attached housing, which I think suggests we may be looking at allocating more of our needed units of that type along with middle housing in CFAs. But I don't want to make sure that my conclusions are not correct. So those are my questions.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think those were super clear, Kevin.
Yeah, those are great questions, Damien. And I need to be crystal clear on this point. So the 30%, it is confusing. So our goal is over time to see 30% of housing units in climate-friendly areas. And that is the requirement in terms of how local governments are to size or estimate how much area do we need to be within a climate-friendly area. But that calculation is different from actually addressing needed housing and land needs for residential purposes. So to say, 30% of housing has to be in climate-friendly areas, and then 70% is the remainder elsewhere, is not actually the case when you get down to say a HNA analysis, a housing needs analysis, and presumably maybe even a UGB expansion. You're going to identify those housing needs based on past production trends. And so if you're achieving certain densities, within the different zones, you're still going to you're going to be able to allocate to address your residential land needs based on actual production, not the theoretical residential buildable area within climate-friendly areas. Obviously, our goal over time is to see increased housing production in climate-friendly areas, but that will not be subtracted from land supply for other residential needs any more than the actual amount of residential development we see in climate-friendly areas. I know that's I'll, as Kirsten said, we'll have graphics that, or at least some slides that will better tell this story for commission tomorrow. It's a complicated issue, but hopefully that answers your question, or at least one of your questions.
On that first question, yeah, could we check on that, Damon? Was
Yes.
that?
Yes, no, that helps. I think that helps. That will help me lower the blood pressure of a number of folks I work with. So great, thank you.
You bet.
My second question was on housing mix regarding whether I'm correct that as we look at, and this is somewhat, I think somewhat related, as we look at CFAs, are we again looking at an area where we're going to be allocating more of our housing needs for both middle housing and then what I'm going to call like multi-story, multiple units per building housing or multifamily attached housing?
Good question. In terms of what types of housing will qualify within climate-friendly areas, we'll basically pencil. We've added more flexibility for local government to determine what the appropriate housing types are. But again, as has been referenced before, there are certain minimum densities that we're trying to achieve. So there are some housing types that are going to be more able to meet that density than others. The residential potential in climate-friendly areas is something that will need to be factored into future housing needs analyses. However, in the framework of that HNA, the local government will continue to look at actual housing production by zone. And so, for example, if you implement climate-friendly areas and then the next time you do your HNA analysis, you look at actual housing production that occurred within the HNA, and that you might get a density that's 10 units per acre, because not all development in climate-friendly areas is going to be residential. So that average density could be lower than the actual minimum densities. And that is the number that would inform your residential land needs. If you've gotten 10 units per acre, that's the number that says, okay, this is basically the residential area, or our expectations for residential development in these areas moving forward. So it wouldn't unduly restrict your meeting residential land needs elsewhere. Over time, obviously, we need to boost. We very much want to see those numbers increase, but it's an incremental process, and we're just getting started on trying to set the table for that climate-friendly type of development.
Long range planning.
Yeah.
Defined.
Okay. No, that's perfect. Thank you very much.
Great.
Damon, thanks. Thank you. Thanks for serving. I think we have Al next, which may be a perfect segue, and then Mary Cal, and then Julie, and then Samantha. Please.
Okay, thank you, Kirsten, and greetings to everyone from an Airbnb in Spokane. I'm supposed to be wrangling grandkids right now, but I got a hall pass, I guess. So I hope the connection is good. Anyway, semi delighted to be here. I don't have an affiliation at the moment. I'm a retired land use lawyer. Most of you know who I am, maybe a few don't, but I had a statewide land use practice. Before that, I was an LCDC hearings official. Probably, I'd say most of the Land Use Board of Appeals and Court of Appeals and Supreme Court decisions having to do with the integrity of the HNA analysis process, having whether or not land is actually available, whether or not it is actually buildable, whether it should be counted in spite of various kinds of constraints, are cases in which I represented the prevailing party. I also have some deep background in Jackson County. For those of you down south, way back in the day, I think there were like 8 appeals of the original urban growth boundaries in Jackson County in the 1970s. I was the LCDC's hearings officer on all of those, so I know the territory down there pretty darn well, and I certainly sympathize with those concerns. I also, while I'm giving my CV here, I did draft a paper that Steve Schelt introduced as the basis for requiring the LCDC do its policymaking by rulemaking. And so I'm, should probably be burned at the stake for that, but it happened. It's had its benefits and it's had its costs over the years for sure. And then probably the thing I'm most proud of is the first Goal 10 case that LCDC decided involving fair share, which tied it directly back to the 1968 Federal Fair Housing Act, the Kerner Report, the issue of racial and residential segregation. And in that opinion, the commission itself called for rulemaking. And so our housing rules, all the rules we're talking about here, have some DNA going back to that decision. Over the years, I've cheered and booed along the way, and right now I'm in the process of being part of the process of moving this forward, and I'm very pleased to have had a part in it. I think the other thing I can offer is that over the last 50 years, I've lived in the Eugene Springfield area, I've lived in the Portland area, I've lived in the Bend area. And something I think is relevant right now to the questions that Jeremy and Damon and Kevin have been talking about is the experience that I think Kirsten was involved a bit. I know Damon was, which was the residential lands HNA analysis that Ben went through leading up to his 2016 urban growth boundary expansion. And that talked about how that process was one which went through all the steps that for instance, Jeremy's asked about and Kevin's talked about, that involve looking at what is realistically possible, ground truthing, looking at need, looking at past trends, adopting efficiency measures, and then when you actually expand the urban growth boundary, assigning some priority to those lands which best meet the needs for affordable housing, not just high-end housing, because of getting the fit between the housing needs analysis and the kind of housing you're bringing in. As a result, the city of Bend, when it expanded its urban growth boundary, it brought in lands with specific allocations for higher density housing close to high schools, brand new high schools, close to employment centers like in Northwest Crossing. And it did that in a way in which property owners actually volunteered to accept deed restrictions, because that allowed them to come in to get priority in coming into the urban growth boundary. Then going back to Kevin's point about the urban growth boundary expansions that keeps kind of coming up, I'd like to emphasize that the reason that we don't have to answer all the kinds of questions that Damien and Jeremy have raised here at this point is that the rules as drafted now clearly separate this process from the much more detailed analysis and incremental process that is called for under the needed housing statutes, which requires you to ground truth, requires you to look at past trends. It requires you to look at efficiency measures. And it requires you to look at those efficiency measures, not just in terms of what you do in the way of expanding urban growth boundaries, and not just in CFAs. It means that you have to look at those areas outside CFAs, inside urban growth boundaries, where there's a potential for zone changes, where there's a potential for density increases, where there's a potential for enabling construction of cottage-style homes or manufactured housing, small manufactured houses on individual lots. I'm currently on a work group with Representative Marsh, Mary Kyle, John Van Lanningham, Bill Van Vliet, a number of other people, looking at specifically the Jackson County's issue of trying to find ways in which we can actually let people own homes without being renters that are manufactured and prefabricated homes on very small lots inside existing urban growth boundaries or on efficiently developed land in any expansion areas. Those are issues which I think the language that staff has currently proposed that separates this process from the HNA analysis allows us to continue to do. The concern I think a lot of people have is that somehow, and that I had up to now, was that the fact that we have CFAs and they have an allocation, they have a capacity analysis that says that they need to be sized to accommodate a certain amount of a certain type of housing. And that type of housing is going to be 900 square foot units on average. It's going to be high density. It's going to exclude a lot of housing types. And it's going to, in some cases, it's going to be possible. In some cases, it's going to be not possible. And we're going to monitor that, and we're going to hope that that works out, and we're going to add CFA capacity over time if it doesn't work out. So we will learn as we go, but we'll do that as things are drawn up now without prejudging or compromising an analysis that a huge amount of time and effort, expertise has been invested in over the years. So I think right now, the last thing I'd like to do is just give an example of Northwest Crossing in Bend, where I lived. I lived in an attached townhouse, and Susan and I bought an attached townhouse in Northwest Crossing on a collector's street, Northwest Crossing Avenue there. About a year after we moved in, the transit district came in and asked if they could put a bus stop in front of our townhouse group. But we were the only family that said yes to that. So they tore up our sidewalk. They put in a bus stop, which was right out in front of our house. And then nobody used it. And nobody used it to such an extent that 4 years later, before we moved, they came in, they took out the bus stop, and we no longer had diesel engines idling out in front of our house, because the only use for that bus stop that we ever saw was people idling their buses while they waited for the schedule to shape up. So that area would not qualify as the whole Northwest Crossing area. It's 2,000 homes. It has a huge amount of affordable housing in it. And the neighborhood has welcomed that. We spent a lot of time, Susan and I and others, educating the neighborhood until we actually got a lot of support for that. We have some great affordable housing projects out there, senior and young families. We don't want cities to be able to say, cities that aren't like Bend, to be able to say, well, we don't need to use our efficiency measure requirements under the HNA statutes to encourage zoning in those areas, because the folks out there are unhappy about that. So we have to go out and expand urban growth boundaries, or it's all going to happen in these CFAs. We want cities, we want regions to continue to be required to disperse affordable housing opportunities for both rental and ownership purposes throughout the urban areas, because I think that's what Goal 10 requires. I think that's what equity requires. I think there's been a lot of confusion about the term opportunity areas. And I will just tell you that the states of California, the states of Washington, states of Minnesota, they consider the opportunity areas to be primarily those areas that that are outside what we're going to be describing as CFAs. That's where in Northwest Crossing, that's where the new jobs are. That's where the good schools are. That's where the nearby stores are. And so those are, I'm not saying that there aren't opportunity areas in CFAs. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't be doing all the mitigation, all the displacement, and all the investment that we are promising. I think that's all on the come. There's actually no obligation to actually do any of that. We're just saying we will do it. We should be doing all those things, no question about it, but we shouldn't be doing it at the expense of the access to the opportunity areas that exist between those CFAs and our existing urban growth boundaries, or in any new expanded areas. So thank you for, giving me a big part of your 2 hours here to do my full spiel. If you go back, I've been writing about this for quite some time, and I just really appreciate the opportunity to kind of explain myself at length. So thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. Kevin or other team members, would you like to comment on Al's explanation there?
I'll just say, I think Al's input has been hugely helpful for this effort, and it has been, I think, a really, really constructive dialogue that we've had to sort of navigate how we create aspirational target for where we need to be for a climate-friendly future in the context of the way that we currently and will continue to plan to meet all residential needs within cities. So thank you very much for your engagement on this.
Thank you, Al. And you're welcome to use our hall pass as long as you like, but I suspect there's some very adorable grandchildren, but it's good, really great to see you. Thank you for making the time and your continued guidance. Mary Kyle?
Thank you, Mary Kyle McCurdy with 1000 Friends of Oregon. I wanted to share an observation about confusion that I think I've heard from a number of local governments, and I've shared and understand why. And I think the rules have evolved since the early versions, but I'm not sure, and maybe the staff can ensure that these are clearer. I believe, and I had this concern too, that there's a perception that there's one main CFA in each of these MPO cities, and that there's been a lot of attention spent on the densities that would be in that CFA, when actually I think the intent of the rule, but it's not clearly talked about, I think, is that that there should be a variety of different scales and types of CFAs in every city, because this isn't just about density. It's about making sure that everyone, and particularly that everyone, has the opportunity to get around without primary reliance on a car for all of their trips. And therefore, we need a variety of different types and scales of CFAs scattered throughout a community. Not everyone is going to live in the downtown area. And yet a lot of what we hear is the, how many, multi-story, what the density is, et cetera, that has been tossed around about what would be more appropriate for some downtowns, not even all the downtowns. And so I think it's important that it be clear, or maybe clearer than it is now, that CFAs are anticipated to be in of different scales, and that there will be a handful of them in every city. And actually a lot of this work has been done, or like initial analysis. Earlier someone was talking about one of the local government speakers was talking about needing the analysis and technical assistance to get at this. And DLCD and ODOT have done a lot of work already on place types. You can just go to DLCD's website, type in place types, and you'll see this for all the MPO areas, that recognize that there's different area types and development, and there's different densities appropriate in each of those, whether it's a suburban neighborhood center or a downtown, and different types in between. So I think the kind of mushiness of the way it might be written, or the lack of clarity now, is not serving local governments well. And I think what the intent is, that in that first year or two, now I can't remember what the time frame is in the current version of the proposed rules, that there will be CFA planning back and forth between a local government and DLCD to designate the CFAs that there is a lot of flexibility for cities to designate different types of CFAs and different scales, and to remember that the goal isn't just density, it is a variety of housing types and more dense housing types within walking distance of a mix of uses, and that there's a full complement of uses. And that the point here is to reduce VMT, not simply to build dense housing, and that if that can be achieved, and that can be achieved in a variety of different ways and at different scales of density and housing types, including housing types that are more affordable to build just from the ground up. And that not all of the CFAs will necessarily have great transit, at least today. And most people's, 1 to 3 mile trips are not going to work, but they're walking to the grocery store or to school, or they ought to be able to walk to the grocery store or to school or to the hardware store. So I think it would be really useful if that was cleared up more, because I hear that confusion and the emphasis on these like higher densities and the some of the quantitative elements that are in the proposed rules now. And again, I think it'd be helpful if that could be clearer, and that the end goal is VMT reduction, providing different ways for folks to get around, and to remember that affordability is not just the rent or the mortgage, but it's also how affordable is it to live. Can you get around without always using a car, owning a second car, et cetera. Then finally, I just wanted to make one thing on the clear and objective standards. The clear and objective standards have been in 197, 307, sub 4 for several decades. There was a tweak to them in the in Senate Bill 1051 that was passed in 2017, I think, which people call the ADU bill, but it had a lot more going on in it. But I just want to make clear those clear and objective standards, the requirements for local governments to have clear and objective standards for residential development applications, has been around for a few decades, and is very important to the development community and others. So just want to clear that up. Thank you.
Thanks, Mary Kyle. Kevin, team, Bill, any responses or comments on Mary Kyle's?
I appreciate the comments, Mary Kyle. Thank you. Just be crystal clear, or try to be. I know the rule language is not always that, and we can strive to clarify this issue. There's no requirement for a variety of CFAs. There is an allowance for local governments to do so. So we're trying to provide a lot of flexibility. So if a city wanted to say, we want to put all our CFA in a more intensive area with taller building heights, they could do so. Or they could say, well, we're going to establish one primary CFA that, is more aspirational. And then we're going to have a whole bunch of less intensive CFAs in areas that make sense throughout the community. And both are possible under the current draft.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Kevin. And Mary Kyle, thank you also for serving and your extensive guidance and participation for this process, and also many, many precursor processes. Next, please, Julie, and then Samantha. Julie, also serving on the RAC, thank you.
Hi, so I want to sort of bring in the transportation side of this to some of the discussion. I guess I specifically have a question about, so I'm not a housing person, so a lot of this discussion has been about the housing needs and the difference between the allowance in the CFAs versus the HNA, where you're looking at sort of what's been happening. So my question is sort of, how does that then transfer over to transportation planning? The way it sounds to me is that we're going to end up with sort of like these two realities. One sort of an aspirational goal of, CFAs with a certain density development, and then another one that's more aligned with the HNAs. So what are we doing our transportation planning for? The way I read it, it seems like we're supposed to be doing it for that aspirational one, which means we're not then planning for the housing needs that we're projecting through the HNA. And I can see that causing confusion, but maybe I'm wrong.
Well, you're right, certainly right to ask the question, Julie. Thank you. Bill, do you have an answer there? Would you be on point for this, or?
Yeah, so we have a rule, draft rule 340, which talks about how local governments should make land use assumptions for transportation planning purposes. And I don't know that I've, since we've kind of shifted how the climate friendly areas work, I'm not sure that Kevin and I have had a chance to really sit down and say, what's the best way to make those allocations? Is it based on the CFAs, which I think that's kind of the way rules written right now, or is it something different based on the HNA? And I'm not as much of a housing person either, Julie. So I think I need to kind of maybe sit down with Kevin and work through that and think through the implications of that. But that's a good point. Thank you.
You're welcome. And I guess I know that, I've heard loud and clear from DLCD staff and the commission that, no more time is to be allocated for developing these rules. But this is just an example of the type of thing that I think that more time would help us to work through some of the, better understand this and how to make it work.
Thank you, Julie. Let us get back to you and kind of others on that point, since Kevin and Bill are able to kind of clarify that and signal that in rule. And the next time, just a kind of a time process check on the rule development. Appreciate people coming in today and raising these points, and just really for continued sort of shared learning and understanding. And Julie, for pointing out this question, you would see a correction to that and clear guidance on that by the time, I would think, Kevin and Bill, I hope I'm not creating a false deadline here, but pretty much we have to have things patted down by the first week of February. So I believe that's next week, first full week of February, midweek, for the Department of Justice to initiate their kind of sweep through again the rules. So this point, we'll have a recommendation coming up pretty quick. So I would just ask that staff to perhaps get back to Julie and or others with however this lands, because that's obviously a very, very important distinction of how transportation planning is done in Oregon in the MPO. So thanks, Julie. Samantha and then Alex, and at 10:30 I will ask a volunteer from our team to take over kind of facilitation while I dip out to another meeting. So Samantha, please.
Sure, thank you. Samantha Bear, Housing Program Director for the Oregon Home Builders Association. I want to go back, sorry, I know we just moved to transportation, but back onto housing to talk about in more detail the relationship between this rulemaking and then the HNA and the document that the department just put out about Oregon housing needs, next steps for equitable housing production, and kind of how those correlate. So I think some of the issues we have raised with concerns about the rules related to equity, housing type, housing choice, density remains a concern. And I've heard, we've bifurcated the issues. The HNA is where kind of we'll be able to solve that and dive into that. And then we'll be able to use housing production strategies to overcome those issues, or local governments will. And I just still remained concerned because a lot of the issues we are highlighting as possible outcomes of these rules are the same issues that the HNA, as it develops and evolves through this new process and this document, are also trying to prevent and to solve. So I'm concerned at how, if something plays out where the rules go into effect, we have CFAs, we have cities holding, pretty high density requirements. We don't see middle housing build out. We definitely don't see single family build out. We only see kind of for rent multifamily apartments, because that's where the market goes. That then informs our HNA, which says, as the new 2003 work is supposed to do, it's not just supposed to look at numbers, it's supposed to look at affordability, it's supposed to look at housing type, it's supposed to be holistic. And we say, okay, we're not seeing all of the outcomes and the equity outcomes that we want. I just don't know how a local government is able to move forward with production strategies and fix that if the administrative rules are a factor in contributing to those kind of negative outcomes, and how they're supposed to work around that because they're held to complying with an administrative rule. And so that is just still, and maybe someone can walk me through, like, at a very ground truthing level. And I know this is hypothetical. What happens if that's the case, if our H&A shows us that we're not achieving equity outcomes and we need to allow for more middle housing, we need to do these things, but they're not allowed to do that in a CFA, and maybe there's quite a few CFAs. What is a local government supposed to do?
Sure, that's a really good question. I'm just finishing writing my note about it. Samantha, thank you. Just give us a moment, please, so we catch up. So would, basically, could a CFA be a barrier to identified housing needs, solving for identified housing needs? Kevin, you have a...
Sure. Yeah, I guess, I think I've sort of described how, the CFA designation is kind of setting an aspirational target for development. We hope it's successful. We need to see more climate-friendly development to meet our climate pollution reduction goals. That should not interfere with housing markets for other housing types, as identified by an HNA and as provided for, in that process that local governments go through. And the larger cities now will be doing that every 6 or 8 years, based on the requirements from House Bill 2003. If you're asking, what if this project is wildly successful and we see more housing developed in climate-friendly areas and less demand for single-family detached, that's conceivable, and frankly, single-family detached currently is the least affordable housing type that's out there. Now, there's a lot of middle ground between, single-family detached and, high-rise residential development. And we're not necessarily talking about, Pearl District kind of development here. A lot of this, especially with the flexibility that Mary Kyle just described in terms of the CFA regulations, is probably mid-rise. It may not be nearly the level of intensity or entail the construction costs that you might see with taller structures. But again, if there continues to be a demand and a need to provide other housing types, so lower density residential housing types, middle housing types, and that is meeting a housing need, these rules will not preclude local governments from addressing those residential land needs for those housing types as well.
I will just say I don't think that's clear in the outset of the rules, and perhaps that last part, the explanation of you don't think this will happen, could be expressed in a document or something. My concern is actually the opposite. What if this is a wildly unsuccessful plan and the demand is not for multifamily apartments? The demand, people don't want to remain in a renting situation. They want duplexes. They want homes that they can own. And they want to do it in places that they can walk to all of the places they want to and have awesome public transit and all of those things. But we've put minimum density requirements in place within CFAs where those products aren't allowed. And I've heard from a couple local governments now that the densities outlined are going to preclude a number of middle housing options, and only kind of provide for your really higher density options, which we know are not being built for ownership. So that's my question, is not if what if this is successful, it's what if this is unsuccessful because the market demand isn't there.
So if that were the case, and we did not see the housing development in climate friendly areas that we're hoping to see, the process that cities use today to plan for their residential needs would continue. And so essentially, as I've said, it's based on recent housing production. And so if it turns out this doesn't work and there is a need for residential development in other zones, then the current process would be able to continue. And local governments, for example, would say, okay, if we've seen we need more low density residential, this is the density, say we're getting 8 units per acre there, and we need to expand our UGB to meet those needs. This would not preclude that. The only point at which the climate friendly area housing impedes or would conflict with meeting other housing needs is to the extent that that actual housing occurs within those climate friendly areas. And I see Gordon Howard's got his hand up. Maybe you want to jump in on this question. Oh, you're muted, Gordon.
Sorry. Okay, Samantha, as I understand it, what you're asking is, or suggesting is that you would have a climate friendly area with a minimum density provision, and the demand to people who, households that actually want to locate in that climate friendly area but don't want to live at that level of density that is the minimum. And so they would want to be at a very small single family home development or a duplex type development that was below the density limits that were set. Is that where you're coming from?
Yes.
Okay, I think that's an interesting, conundrum, if you will, because the point of, there has to be a certain, minimum threshold, if you will, of people living in proximity to all those facilities to make those facilities viable in terms of, commercial uses, the transit and all that. So there is, I think that, I think that's the point, is that we're trying to figure out what that would be. And we certainly would, welcome input from local governments as to what that level is. But on the other hand, if we make it too low, it's no longer a climate friendly area because there isn't the population in the area that would be that tipping point to make it climate friendly in terms of supporting all of the services and amenities that are in that area. So I think that's kind of the conundrum as I see it that you've raised, and it's an interesting question.
Yeah, and Gordon, so I would encourage the agency to reach out to some of your, I'm going to call them like mid-sized cities, particularly Medford, Ben. Well, Ben doesn't feel mid-sized anymore. Sometimes it feels big, but some of your middle-sized cities or suburban cities, and ask them what densities they're currently seeing for build out, because I've heard from practitioners in those areas, and they have a pretty good understanding of, when you look at density requirements, of what can be built and what cannot based upon current market trends. And I don't think, the densities are that far off, but I think changing things by 5 or 10 even could really allow for a lot more housing type and alleviate some of these concerns, and to get to something that's more realistic for the market. I understand that you need densities because we have to do VMT reduction. I understand, like, that's the point that we're trying to drive, but I wonder if there is a room to find middle ground that sort of achieves both goals.
Samantha, could I just have to peel off, but I'm dying to ask a question for clarification. When you said changing things by 5 or 10, what did you mean? It's just missing me.
So like going from 25 dwelling units per acre to 20 dwelling units per acre. Or 15.
You mean lowering? So I
Yeah.
think too, I think, you've invited staff to continue to think about this, and we're sort of obsessing on this, on these points as well. So please know that you're not, your points are very well taken. And thank you also, Samantha, for serving on the Rules Advisory Committee. This really, I just have to remind, I think everyone knows, but this really is long range planning. And we don't expect, just because we allow more development, that the market's, immediately going to respond. So I think we just have to set it to a level of expectations and review that is, it's in a sort of a long range time frame. We don't know that, that zoning's in the way. we, you know, we just kind of have to see how these work out over time as well. And with that, probably not very intelligent comment, I'm going to bow out and or very helpful comment. I'm going to bow out and ask Matt Kroll, the Planning Services Division Manager, to lead us through, sort of quarterback facilitation on this. I'll come back in, but in a listening mode, and Matt will take us through the end of the meeting. So thank you, Matt, and thank you, everyone. Matt, you've probably seen that Samantha, you know, if she has any closing comments, that's certainly welcome. And then Alex is also in the queue from City of Medford. Thank you, everyone. We'll be back. And Chair McCarthy will also be back too. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. And I'll pass the mic. So thank you for letting me make those comments.
Thanks, Samantha.
All right, then, Alex, you're up.
First of all, I really want to thank everyone that's made comments here today. I think the City of Medford agrees with a lot of them. We're also very supportive of what the rule is trying to do. I think a lot of our concerns are out of how to be successful with the rule. And without getting into details, I think we have some detailed concerns that we've been provided as written comment, and we'll probably continue to do that as the rule progresses. But I am concerned that, and I'm going to use my very small world, real life experience of developing code for the city. As we developed code and went through and worked with stakeholders, and we thought we were in a really good place. And then when we adopted the rules, and then in implementation, a lot of things came out that were not expected. And I heard Kristen ask earlier how she didn't think that the rule could prohibit needed housing or something to that extent. And I think that's a lot of unintended consequences. We don't know. I just feel like, and I'm saying this from my personal viewpoint, being incredibly busy and not being able to engage as much as I'd like to with the RAC as we've had our 11 meetings, but the rules came together in pieces. And then at the end, we got a whole bunch of it all at once. And in this track change form, looking at it, I've had a real hard time to be able to sit down and really understand what it means to implement these rules and how it's going to impact and what are those, you know, the unintended consequences that may occur. I've heard staff say a lot of helpful things today. I think everyone's appreciated those comments, but is that what the rule actually says? Staff tells us something, and then we're going to adopt the rule. And then when we go to implement, are we going to be able to rely on that? And I think, generally speaking, I wish I had time, and I don't, and I'm sure no one else does. I understand staff is being, you guys are in a rock and a hard place between getting what the commission wants accomplished and working with your stakeholders. But how do we take an example of the rules and try to implement them and see where we would have challenges, fatal flaws? And that's the part I wish that we have time to do. And I realize that may be challenging, but I'm very concerned about some of the things that are going to come out of this rule that are going to make people either give up and not do anything, and that will not progress the needle forward, or we will not have the time to be successful. And I think some of the timeframes, the 3 years to get things done, is going to be very challenging for cities like Medford, and I assume several other cities. Doing a TSP update is not a minor thing for a city like Medford. And so those types of things, along with some of the details, the technical details of actual implementation, like the VMT reduction at a per development analysis, is going to be incredibly challenging for cities to implement and for developers to actually get realistic numbers to show that they are able to do this. So mine is more of a statement. I don't know if I have questions, but you know, I'm concerned that we will fail because we didn't have time to actually be able to see how this is going to be implemented. And that's where I'll stop. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Those are important thoughts. Yeah, I didn't hear a question exactly in there. So if there was something you want us to try to address as a specific question, we can. I would just say on the time, the the adoption is scheduled for May. So it's not today. It's not this week. There is time to think and to find. And certainly I'm very familiar with the law of unintended consequences. And so I think we're constantly combing through the rules, looking for those spots that might have it. And if you find one, send it our way. Definitely. We want to do those. Want to find those.
Real quickly, though, I didn't have a
Please.
question, but I think it was difficult for the RAC to be able to have that type of back and forth type of discussion that the previous RAC I was involved in, where we were in person, it was much smaller. I felt it was much more of a bill. I don't feel like we've gotten into those details of actually implementing and seeing the those challenges. And I think it's going to be difficult for cities to do that. I would like to get a copy of the rules without track changes on, so I can just start going through it if that's at all possible. I don't think I ever received that. I think it's always with the additional, or not track changes, but the additional commentary. I'd like that all removed and just see what the rule.
Oh, okay. Yeah, because no, we avoided track changes because we were afraid it would be terribly confusing if we used track changes. A version without the little, there's a box that has some commentary. You want to take all of that out?
I would just like to see the rules as proposed, just as they're going to be written up personally, but.
Okay, thank you. I think that's something we probably could produce, go through and just kind of delete those boxes.
Thanks.
All right, next up, Carl.
Hi, Carl McNair, also with the City of Medford. I did not serve on the RAC, but Alex has been passing a lot of the materials along to me. And I've been really focused on the transportation piece. I'm the transportation manager in public works here at the city. And I guess my questions really center around tools to use to accomplish the goals of this new rule. And Alex mentioned like estimating BMT reduction on specific developments. Also, for me, developing performance standards that get at the goals of the rules and get away from congestion measurement as our primary performance standard. That, I guess, I don't think we really have great tools in place currently to do those things. And if we're going to implement this rule and be successful in it, I guess, is DLCD working on anything, or are there processes in place to develop those tools so that we can measure BMT reductions and develop these new performance standards that will actually get at the goals of the rule?
Those are good questions. Heard that from quite a few. The two staff who could best answer that are Cody Meyer at DLCD and Brian Hurley from ODOT, Department of Transportation. They both had to leave to that meeting that was mentioned that Kirsten went. There's an interagency meeting going on talking about a lot of these rules that somehow got scheduled for this same time slot here. And so that's not something we can answer to you right now in detail. I can say that we're aware that the tools, that there have been decades of tool development towards that congestion, measuring congestion, projecting congestion, estimating congestion, micro simulating congestion. And there have not been the same decades of development on tools to look at how to reduce the pollution from the transportation system. But there have been several years, and it is moving along, and we are aware that we are putting effort into that, and will be continuing to put effort into it and putting money into consulting to try to have better tools. There are some pretty good tools that give good general answers as far as what are the kinds of policies and actions that local governments can take that lead to less driving and less polluting, more transit, more biking, more walking. Those are pretty clear. Parking, that people see a price for parking. These are the kinds of policies in general terms, we know are the right policies that move in that direction. But you're right, Carl. We can't always do the kind of the estimate to say, well, if you have this many more of X, you will get that much more Y. And just because the congestion measurement tools have been under development for so many decades. And so you're absolutely right that we need to continue to improve those tools while moving in the right direction that we know we need to move, even if the tools can't tell us exactly how far and how much. That's at least that's been our approach. I should say that's been our approach to all of this. Open for debate and discussion if you have other thoughts on that. But thank you for raising that. Anything else you wanted to say on that or follow up, Carl?
No, I appreciate that. I guess it's my concern is, when we do our TSP update, we're going to have our next TSP update. We're going to have to put those standards in place, and they're going to have to be standards that are clear and objective standards that we can apply to every development that comes in. And the tools that are out there are a little, at least from my experience with them, which has not been very extensive, they seem fairly squishy and not like clear and objective standards. So I hope this all works out, and that by the time we're doing putting those standards in place, they are more clear and objective, but it's a major concern right now.
Maybe if I have a couple clarifying questions to understand where Medford is a little bit. You mentioned a TSP update. Do you have a particular time in mind for when the next update would happen at Medford?
No, we just adopted one 4 years ago in 2018. So we probably have, we'll wait a little while and allow some of these tools to be developed. But I guess with the rule going into place and not seeing the tools yet, it's still a concern.
Well, understandable. I was not trying to undercut your concern, just trying to help understand a little bit where you were in that cycle, so you don't have a particular date, which is not unusual. The other one that we've talked about a lot that I'd be curious to know, you mentioned the performance standards, and in our rules, at least, that's a very technical term, and it really applies to the section in Rule 60, or lovingly called 060, about the rezones. But I know that many cities also have some sort of an internal process, not defined by state rule, but defined by your own development code, where you review a proposed development, even if there's no rezoning involved. The development is compliant with the zoning, but you do a transportation analysis of some sort as part of permitting that development. Does Medford have that? Do you use congestion standards for that kind of internal development analysis when there's no rezone?
No, we don't in Medford. We might do a more localized safety analysis looking at access points and things like that, but we don't apply the congestion standards in the same way.
Okay. Well, that will simplify things then somewhat, that you would only really use those performance standards, when we use that term, is only comes up when you're doing the rezoning, and it would be subject to the 060 analysis in TPR 060, the existing Rule 60. Thank you. It's helpful to understand a little more about how Medford applies some of these. I was stalling there a little bit to see if somebody else would raise their hand, and in fact, they have. I didn't see whether Julie or Damien came first. On my list, it has Julie first, so go ahead.
Julie's first.
Okay.
I just wanted to, I guess, follow up on something that maybe I was a little bit unclear on in terms of the applicability. So there's a section in the transportation section that talks about jurisdictions can only pursue funding for what's the right word, projects through the regional plan. You can only pursue funding for projects that are on the financially constrained list of the TSP. And then there's also a lot of things about, capacity increasing projects. And I guess what I'm wondering is how that ties in with the timing of a TSP update. So for example, we have, development exactions. We have TSDC projects. We have projects in our CIP that increase capacity. Maybe not a lot, often maybe a turn lane or a frontage improvement that maybe adds some capacity. If we have not yet updated our, so I guess there's two questions. If we have not yet updated our TSP, is there anything that says we can't move forward with those projects without doing the additional analysis? And then I guess the second question relates to, seeking funding through a regional transportation plan. First, I guess a question whether or not that's something that DLCD has the jurisdiction to require, but say they do, say you do, then does that only come into play after the TSP has been updated, which currently has no timeline unless you're part of a like Salem, where there's the what's the right word, scenario planning requirement that then triggers in the TSP requirements. That make any sense? Two questions.
So I think, Julie, your questions are about the Rule 830 and the review of the capacity projects. Is that correct?
That's one part of it.
Okay.
And the other one is I think it's 180 that has the thing.
The regional.
Right. But on the 830, I guess, if we don't update our TSP for, I'll pretend here, 5 years. So then does that have no bearing on what we move forward with?
So you have an acknowledged transportation system plan as part of your local comprehensive plan. That's acknowledged, that's in place, and the updates to the rules don't change that. And so I think all along we've said that if you've got an acknowledged TSP, that you wouldn't have to go back through that process in order to keep those plans in that plan. Now, when you come to do a TSP update, I think we're still, we just recently, I think we're going to make some significant changes to the draft 830 that you've seen before. I think there's going to be a number of projects that fell into that before that will not fall into it in the future. And that we're looking at that issue of the grandfathering of certain projects that may have already been planned, or I don't have anything specific to say on that right now, but we are discussing that internally about making a shift there. So, but as far as, in any case, I can't see that we're going to, affect projects that are in an acknowledged TSP now before you've updated your TSP.
Okay, well, that's helpful. And then also I think something else I brought up is, for example, the city of Salem is considering an infrastructure bond measure, taking it to the voters this fall. And so that will be based on our currently acknowledged TSP. And so if we set out funding for 10 years worth of projects that include some projects that may end up being capacity increasing projects, and then we do a TSP after the fact, I would hope that those would be grandfathered in. We would strongly advocate for that.
I would hope that what you're working at now, you're thinking about the scenario planning project you're about to beginning, and you're thinking about the ways that you're reducing the pollution. The list that's going to the voters now is already moving in that direction, right?
Well, where you haven't developed the list yet. We're in the process of doing community outreach right now. It's a very community driven, project. And so, it's sort of, yes, having multimodal facilities is important, but that's not to say there won't be an area of town where there's a capacity increasing facilities that's a priority for our community. So I don't know. It's sort of like you're saying we're presupposing the outcome of some scenario planning that we haven't done. So it's a little bit hard.
I can agree with the last statement. It's definitely hard.
And I guess my other question was related to that regional TSP thing. So requirement that you can only pursue projects from the financially constrained list, which then, and I'm assuming once again that that doesn't apply until the TSP is updated.
Well, yeah, correct. I mean, you wouldn't have a financially constrained list that meets the requirements of the updated rules until you have a TSP that is updated. So,
okay, sorry to be stating the obvious. It's just this is so evolving so quickly and changing that it's hard to keep up.
I would say in general, we've tried over. I mean, we started off definitely kind of all over the place in terms of timing and what happens when, and we've tried more and more and more to tie everything to that next TSP update. So that's my understanding of how that piece of it would go. Now, I'd say our recommendation would be is that projects that should go into a bond measure, projects that should go into a regional transportation plan should try to line up with what we're trying to accomplish here, but that's not the way the rule is written, if that makes sense, in the short term.
Did we get both of those answered, Julie?
Acceptably for the moment.
Okay. Appreciate that. Damien.
Thanks. I had two questions, one of which Julie already asked and you already answered, so thank you for that. My next question, if I can ask it now, is focused on the Division 8 rules. There's some proposed changes to 0050-4A. This is under achieving fair and equitable housing outcomes and under location of housing. And there's two sentences there. One starts with a reference to within metropolitan service district. And then the next begins with cities subject to this rule. And what I wanted to clarify is if that language applies to all cities that are subject to the rules, all cities in the MPOs, or if that new text for 4A is focused in being applicable only to cities and metro.
Thanks for the question, Damien. I'm scrolling to that section of code. It applies to both.
Kevin, would it be possible to share that easily, or would that be distracting or delaying? So,
well, it's not out of the question. Let me just see how clearly that issue is articulated here. Damien, you're looking at 0050 subsection 4A.
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah, I can share that screen if it would be helpful. I've got it up here. Hold on a second. Let's see. I'll only do this briefly because I know it's deadly to look at text on a page. Let me see if I can make this a little larger. So I think we're looking at the underlying language is the new stuff here. So I'll just kind of highlight that section is I think what Damien's referring to. So the intent is to cover both. So within a metropolitan service district, that's within Portland Metro. So cities will describe their progress on accessible dwelling units, mitigating displacement, et cetera, within Region 2040 centers. So that's specific to the metro region. That's their plan for, essentially the equivalent to climate friendly areas within the metro region. And then beyond that, cities subject to the rule and OAR section 0310 or 660-012-0310. Those are the other cities, population 10,000 and over within the other 7 metropolitan planning areas. Does that make sense?
It does. No, thank you. Thank you for letting me clarify it.
Yeah.
So the first sentence you highlighted is only within metro, but the second sentence is all cities over 10,000. Starting from.
Well, yeah. So this first bit, that's all metro. The part that's highlighted now, and the second bit is the other cities within the 7. Population over 10,000 within the 7 metropolitan planning areas. Because this is all in the context of housing production strategy requirements, which are required for local governments or cities population over 10,000.
All right, thank you. Did we get that, Damien?
You did. Thank you very much.
Okay.
I just want to quickly follow up on this last point. Is it possible, and I don't know, maybe I think like a couple RAC meetings ago, we got a chart that kind of outlaid which things applied to which jurisdictions. Do we feel like with the current set of rules that chart is still accurate? And could we get maybe like an updated version of that?
I think the answers to that are no and yes. That the chart that you had before does not reflect everything that is going on. And yes, we are working on an updated chart. We understand that it's very helpful. It's helpful to us. And so we're trying to make sure that we have those and that they do tie to the newest version of the rules.
Okay, thank you.
Glad to know that you enjoyed them, or you at least found them helpful, maybe I should say. I saw a message in the chat from Steve Lambert. Do you want to come on and share your question, Steve, and we'll get that answered?
Yeah, thank you for that. Hey, so we're looking at doing a kind of a minor revision to our TSP to bring in some projects that we recently identified in our active transportation plan, remove some projects that have since been completed, and then bring in, realize the additional funding that we've received through House Bill 2017 recently with some of the transportation funds that have arrived. So our understanding, and I just want to make sure that we're kind of working off the same understanding as your team, is that if completed with this minor revision by the end of this calendar year and notification kind of as written in the proposed rules was provided to DLCD by the end of the year, we did not have to complete the TSP revision under the scenarios provided in the new rules. We were able to do so under existing rules. So just wanted clarification on that as we kind of work towards that end goal.
That's correct. That's the way the rules are written right now. We are aware that people are doing TSP updates right now, and we didn't want to have people go through an entire process of updating the TSP and then come at the very end like, oh no, actually we moved the goalposts. So we try to give folks a little bit of time to do that. That's correct. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you. I appreciate the clarification.
Hey, Bill, if we could just go one step deeper on that, maybe what Steve described sounds like it would fit within. I think there's a definition of a minor update and a major update, or did I get those?
Yeah, so the updated rules do kind of split, how they have two different paths for a TSP update. The rules written right now, the way the TPR is written, basically assumes nobody has a TSP and everyone's got to do it for the first time, is how it's written right now. So we're trying to move into a world where, yes, everyone's got a TSP already. How do you do an update? And we're trying to make it a little bit more clear about how that works and how to do kind of a small scale update.
Yeah, that's as written under the new rules, correct, Bill? Yeah.
All right. I believe, Aaron, you're up next.
Matt. So my understanding, part of the reason for convening this particular meeting was to make sure that we had representatives from DOJ and then local jurisdiction counsel available as well. And so I'm hoping that's true. I know that we had Washington County Council represented here. I've heard a number of points and questions asked here to which DLCD staff have responded something in the vein of, we think that's fine. And I'm just a little uncomfortable with that. I think we've had some legal questions raised today, and I want to make sure that DLCD staff are taking detailed notes and that any of those questions will be run back through DOJ for an official response. I think there are some cases where we may need some clarification in these rules. Specifically, a point that Julie made a few minutes ago, I'd like to bring back up again, which is that she asked a question about if it is within DLCD's authority to require the financially constrained project list and require that jurisdictions can only fund projects that are on that financially constrained project list. I think that's a really important question, and I think that's something that we need to get some clarification on. That also leads to another question, which is that I think a lot of our jurisdictions are going to end up with interim TSPs because it does take many years to do a full major transportation system plan update. In that middle time, when we have these interim TSPs, I think we could end up in some really murky situations where we are funding a project or selecting a project for funding, but that project is possibly capacity increasing or would fall into that, or that project may not be something that would be included on a financially constrained list. And I think that we could, as jurisdictions, face legal challenges from developers or from adjacent property owners in cases like that. I can think of a really specific example for Washington County where we are currently allocating our major street transportation funding improvement projects for the 23-28 funding cycle. So we're selecting projects in 22 that will be funded in 23-28. When our projects go through the project development process, we have a section in our community development code that public facilities go through. As a part of going through that community development code process, I'm concerned that we could have communities raise concerns that the project is no longer consistent with state rules. So I understand this is a pretty complicated question, but I think this is the type of question that could come up over the next number of years. So I think it's important to take a look at these rules and think about that interim TSP timeframe and what it means for a jurisdiction's TSP to be consistent with the rules as they were written when the TSP was adopted, and how we can move forward with projects during that interim time period.
Steve, do you wish to say anything at this time? Nope. So sorry to call you out there, Steve. Steve Shipsey is our lawyer at Department of Justice. He is listening today, not commenting. So we can take those questions to him. I don't think, Aaron, there's anything more we can really say about it today, other than, I guess, if you see some very specific points that you're worried about, please do send them. We do general reviews on things, but if there's specific concerns, it does help us focus in on those. And so what I caught in my detailed notes that I've been taking the whole time here was the question about the financially constrained list and whether we can require cities to have a financially constrained list as part of the planning process. And then some questions about this interim TSP. And I am, I guess, a little curious about that because I think there's an acknowledged TSP now, and then there will be an acknowledged TSP. So I'm not sure what the interim TSP
Well, the interim
is.
would be a TSP that was acknowledged under the existing rules, as opposed to a future TSP that will be consistent with the new rules. And so that's what I'm getting at with that interim period. Yes, we have an acknowledged transportation system plan, but it does not comply with what it will need to be once we update. And just to clarify too, on the first point, I think DLCD can require as a part of the TPR, the financially constrained project list. That's not what I'm wondering about. What I'm wondering about is, can DLCD then say that jurisdictions can only fund projects on that financially constrained project list? We have a number of different funding sources that can contribute to something like, I know turn lanes come up a lot. We can fund a turn lane with transportation SDCs, for example. Is that still okay, even if that specific turn lane is not on our financially constrained project list? I think that's the kind of detail that some of us in the transportation planning world are bringing up.
Yeah, we've heard that.
Do you want to try to address that one, Bill?
Yeah, I think, yeah, the kind of small scale things that don't rise to the level of being a project on the TSP list. Yeah, I think we can address that. I know that doesn't give you, the certain answer that you're looking for, but I can't remember in the last draft we did something. Maybe we didn't. I can't remember. I have to go back and take a look, but I know that's something that I think we're interested in tackling, that piece of it. Yeah.
Just to jump in, I mean, you in the last draft you included an exemption for projects that have a cost of $500,000 or less, and so I don't know that really hits the mark exactly, but I think it was an attempt to get at that. I was just going to say that last week I got an estimate from engineering for a pedestrian crossing island with an RRFB, and the cost estimate was $500,000. Now, I mean, I was shocked. It's crazy, but that's why, $500,000 doesn't buy you much right now. And our TSPs do not typically include intersection level projects or pedestrian crossing projects. They are all consistent with our plan, but they are not specifically identified to that level of detail.
Yeah, I think we might be mixing up a couple different things here. So the $500,000 is in Rule 830, which is how particular kind of street projects are authorized, and we are going to be changing that number. Just so you're aware, we're moving that number up. But we don't have that threshold for, I think, what Aaron is asking about, which is projects that need to be included or that are not included on the financially constrained plan, but are kind of small enough that they wouldn't be a project at all. But like you say, like a crossing or a turn lane, something like that, that's pretty small scale. Yeah, I think we need a mechanism for making those work, and we're happy to work on you with that.
And this, I think, is something that TSPs have done for decades, have not tried to get down to every level of project, but I don't know very many TSPs. Are there explicit in the Salem TSP, or maybe anybody's TSP, where you say, hey, this class of project or this type of projects are authorized, are planned, are done, but we haven't tried to list all of them? Or has it been more sort of an implicit thought that, of course, the smaller projects aren't listed here, we just all sort of understand that? I'm just curious if anybody has examples of either that in their local TSPs.
I mean, we have policy statements along the lines of, additional improvements may be required at intersections, for example. And on pedestrian stuff, I can't remember if we have a specific policy that might be more implied, but yeah, it's very common to not have that level of detail in your TSP. I mean, to the point, well, just one more thing. I mean, one thing that we have in the TSP in our project list, I'm trying to remember how we exactly word it, but basically we assume we're going to add 5 new traffic signals every 5 years, something like that. We don't say where, maybe that, and those are pretty expensive projects nowadays too.
Yeah, I'll just add, most transportation system plans do not specify intersection level improvements. There are some exceptions to that, and there are some cases where a particular community has identified the need for specificity because there is a special circumstance at this intersection. But most of us keep that fairly general because it's tied to the development that occurs and the specific needs of that development at that intersection.
Thank you. That's helpful. I was looking at one the other day that did have quite a few intersections listed, so I know that I think there's a wide variety. In fact, it was the Hillsborough. The Hillsborough's got a draft one right now that listed a lot, but
Hillsborough did a lot of individual intersection analysis, and that is very unusual in the state.
Well, thank you. It's helpful to know that's an outlier. I should not think of that as typical.
Yes, it's very, very not typical what Hillsborough did with their TSP.
I think what I would encourage, I don't think there's any rule, would be that as TSPs get in the future to have some very clear policy language about these kinds of projects we don't list because we're not trying to get to that level of detail, but we have assumed them or planned them, and they are authorized through the TSP. I think that could be a helpful way. I think I talked over somebody else who wanted to jump in here. Who was that?
Yeah, that was me. This is Samantha, Oregon Home Builders. I'm just asking a clarifying question off of what Aaron was just saying. Is DOJ planning on preparing any formal responses to any of the questions that have been asked throughout this process, or doing any formal analysis after review of the rules that will be shared with the RAC?
We have a formal review process for a draft of the rules. We will be sending that in shortly. I don't know that we'd be having individual questions answered through that. I think it would be by sending in the rule and getting an overall review of the rule. But I guess if there were questions that were really hot on your mind still, let me know what those are, and we can look into that.
So Matt,
That's exactly right, Matt. Is that Chair MacArthur?
yeah, you
didn't-
go ahead, Deputy Director Green. I'm sorry. I just wanted to clarify because there's two different things that are being, there's one thing was being asked and the answer was a little bit different. What my understanding is Steve Shipsey and others at DOJ will be looking at the draft to make sure it's legally, correct. But there are some other issues that were raised today that I've written down, and I think staff has too, that are really important relative to how do these rules apply to existing TSPs, what, and all that kind of stuff. Those are really critically important issues. How do these rules apply to bond measures, as was described in City of Salem in the upcoming, fall season? Those are really important questions, and for jurisdictions to be able to go forth and do their work and fund important projects. So I don't know how we're going to handle that, but I do think it needs to be handled in some way. But maybe I've plopped on you, Deputy Director Green, but please feel free to add to what I just said.
No, that's great. No, thank you. I would just be saying that, I think we will be putting out sort of response to questions. It wouldn't be the attorney responding for the session today. Steve is just on to listen to the concerns, which are, will help inform his review of the rules. But the DOJ will not be putting out response to issues raised today. It would be staff that would do sort of a response to questions or frequently asked questions. Keep in mind that staff are also, I just wanted to put sort of an expectation around, capacity. I know everyone on this call has it. So with great respect to local governments, other advocacy groups and interest groups making time to work on these rules, that is invaluable time. DLCD staff is also human and does have to sleep at night. And they are also trying to carefully read, diagram, and code, the comment letters received. So this forum today is a really great forum. The comment letters are very, very important to us and to commission, and we're working through those. So right now, the primary focus is to improve the rules based on comments and clarifications that everyone has provided, so helpful, and get those to Steve. We will then probably turn, instead of a 20-second break, turn to producing kind of response to questions that we've heard, in addition to some other one-pagers and PowerPoints we'd like to make available for local government so they can brief their boards and commissions as the rules come closer to their first hearing in March. So just hopefully that was helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. Yep, that's helpful clarification.
Kirsten, if I might do one last as moderator before passing back to you, there was a question in the chat from Julie. Do you want to come on and ask that question?
Sorry, this was just going back to something where somebody was talking about a TSP update that they were working on. I think Bill said something about minor TSP updates versus major. My understanding was that the minors were sort of for after you had done a major. So like you couldn't just go in and do a minor update in 2023, for example. And if you were making a minor change, you would have to that would kick you into doing a major update unless you initiate it before December of 2022. Is that understanding correct or not?
Yeah, I think the way the draft rules are written, it might be possible to do a minor update under the existing rules, updating an existing acknowledged transportation system plan, but I think it would be completely dependent on the status and what your existing plan had in it and how close it was to meeting the updated rules. It doesn't explicitly say you have to have it done the major update first, at least that I'm reading right now. I think it's important to remember we're trying to write these rules for the long term, and with the understanding that there's going to be a period over the next few years of transition, right? There's, we're going to get to some point 5-10 years down the road where everyone's going to be doing this stuff. Everyone's going to have the updated plans, and this transition time between what we've got now and where we're heading is going to be the difficult, tricky part. And I think we're hearing, obviously a need for resources. We're working on that, a need for flexibility and figuring out how is that going to work. And I think we're sensitive to that, and we're going to work with our partners on figuring those pieces out.
And just for your reference, the section I was thinking about was 101 sub 5. And so the way I read that was that.
Yeah, you're right. I put that in there. Yep, that's correct. Yeah. Yeah.
So that would mean that you could not do a minor update.
Correct. That's how that's written. Yeah.
So is that, did I sort of, Julie, if I know just very little about housing, I know less, unfortunately, about transportation. I've not been a practitioner in my career in Division 12, only tangentially through community engagement. So by no way do I, and I have great, let me just say this, I have great respect for what you do. Thank you. And Bill, do I understand you to say that that section might be amended, or are you looking at it some more? I just unclear on the step forward on 101.
Well, to Julie's point, since she sent me to that specific provision, I wasn't looking at that part, that section of the rule, and it's pretty clear that what Julie's asking is, yes, the way we've got the draft written right now is you'd have to do a major update of your transportation system plan if you have an existing plan that doesn't meet the updated rules. I don't know. I guess we could look at that, and I'm curious to hear about the use cases. Yeah.
Thank you. There's a lot to look at. I didn't want to add anything to anyone's list, but Julie, did you have any final point on that? I don't see no hands raised.
No, it was just a clarifying based on what was previously stated.
Thank you.
I would appreciate, there being some ability to make an amendment if there's a small amendment after that December 2022 timeline. But, it's not a huge deal. We occasionally have to amend the alignment of a roadway, for example.
Right.
And that's tied to a development. And if that comes in and we say, oh, sorry, we can't do that for another, until we go through this major update, it's a bummer.
Yeah. No, that sounds like just a unintended consequence, but someone would hopefully kick me under the table if there was more to it than that. I can't see anyone, and Bill can't kick me under the table. So Julie, why don't we just get back to you on that issue as well? I have a couple things to get back to you on. Matt, if we could sort of co-facilitate to and through here, I do have to transition to another appointment at 11:20. So if you would continue to and through the end, I'd be grateful. Christina does have her hand up.
I have a quick follow-up question on the point that Julie raised, because this is something that I wasn't thinking about. Springfield has a lot of concerns that I think we've expressed, and Emma Newman will participate in the session on Friday, and I think share those again. But I would like to better understand, as you're looking at that minor and major update piece of it, how that interplays with our required mitigation if a plan amendment would or zone change would significantly affect a transportation facility. So one of the mitigation measures is an amendment to the TSP. And so if that essentially prevents any sort of forward-thinking plan amendment zone changes until the TSP is amended through a major update process, then that's going to significantly affect our ability to sort of upzone properties on a case-by-case basis, which is something that we've been seeing in Springfield in certain low density areas, a desire to upzone those to medium density residential, to kind of do what a little bit of what the CFAC rules are trying to get to happen through regulation has been happening a little bit organically in some areas of Springfield. So I want to make sure that that doesn't prevent us from responding to the private sector's desire to densify certain areas if a small adjustment to a TSP project is needed.
Right. Bill, do you have any comments on that, or Matt?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. I think that's a good point. I will say with climate friendly areas, we expect local governments to need to do some upzoning in those places, and there is a separate rule 325 that talks about how transportation review happens in those places that you're designated as a climate friendly area. That's a different process than 060. So at least in those places, I know you might be talking about places other than climate friendly areas, and even maybe before you're doing a climate friendly area. we can maybe look at addressing those. But I just do want to be clear, inside those climate-friendly areas, we have a different process that does not is not 060.
I would also want to just remember that in a lot of cases that that 060 process has been based around the motor vehicle congestion. And as we talked about earlier, where we have decades of experience of sort of measuring the motor vehicle congestion and tools and that. So I guess I would encourage, as you're looking at these upzonings, I would encourage the upzonings, but to be asking, is it the motor vehicle congestion that's causing you to want to go back to the TSP and change something in the TSP? And maybe the right answer would be to not use the motor vehicle congestion performance standard in some cases, not in all cases. So I'm certainly not saying that there may not be situations. There could be situations where updating the TSP could be part of that. But let's double check that too. Are we using the right performance standards to look at these upzonings?
Thank you, Matt. And Matt, I will pass it back over to you. I'll stay on mute, but I am listening and really appreciate everyone being here today. If I don't get to say so at the end, Matt, we have about 11 minutes left, and I don't know if before the end of Chair McCarthy would want to say anything. Passing it back to you, please, Matt.
All right, and I see like an actual hand instead of a virtual hand from Robert Courtwright, if you want to take the floor.
Yes, thank you. So I wanted to follow up on this kind of timing question for TSP updates. I find the rule a little bit confusing. What I wanted to understand are what the constraints are on local governments putting off doing a TSP update. Looking at the regional scenario planning required of Eugene, Springfield, and the Salem-Kaiser areas, the rule allows or other dates specified in a work program. And then looking at the work program option, it's unclear whether or not a TSP has to be done by, I think the date is June 30th of 2025. So I guess my question for DLCD staff is, are there any limits on how long local governments can put off updating TSPs?
Yeah, thanks, Bob, for the question. This is a key issue that we're going to be bringing in front of the commission to discuss with them tomorrow, because I think it's an important one to say, should we set time limits? What do those look like? I think the way we've got it written right now, it's possible that a local government, choosing not to go through the work program process in Division 12 could just, sit on their existing acknowledged TSP. I think in reality, what happens is TSPs need to get updated. When projects get completed, you run out of projects that are in your local TSP that you'll be able to fund, and they need to be updated from time to time. Things change, and we found our experience over the last few decades is that TSPs are probably one of the most frequently updated pieces of local comprehensive plans because there's funding available to do the updates, and also a lot of transportation funding is reliant on having up-to-date TSPs. The other kind of carrot that the state could work on or is working on is having particular transportation financing funding streams that come from either state or local sources. This would be ODOT, contingent on having an up-to-date transportation system plan. So we think those kind of combination of factors means that we'll see over time local governments updating transportation system plans.
I think that's very optimistic, Bill. The experience is that local governments have put off adopting TSP updates when it's a way to avoid complying with state regulations. And a lot of the comments that I'm hearing from my local colleagues today are saying basically, how long can we put this off? I certainly think we ought to have incentives or requirements that get us there, but I'd be very concerned that the rule isn't going to get there. So just to reflect that concern, thanks.
I'm not seeing any other hands up in the participant list, or if anybody wants to just wave at me in their video or jump in. Carl.
All right, thanks. I wasn't gonna ask this because it's kind of detailed, but since we're in transportation and there's time, so there in reading through this latest draft, there's reporting requirements in the 900s somewhere, and 915, and it says in there that basically if a city or county has not yet set targets, performance targets, and is submitting a major report, which has to happen whenever every 3 years, I believe, when the MPO updates their R2P, then the city or county can do a minor update to update those performance targets. And I guess my question is that given the other section that Julie mentioned earlier that requires a major update if your TSP was adopted under the old rules, how can you then do a minor update if your TSP was adopted under the old rules and doesn't have these performance targets in it? They seem to be in conflict with each other. I guess I don't know if that's just something you'll have to look into, but I figured I'd bring it up.
And that's why we have these meetings, so that people can help us spot these things. Thank you. Sorry, I hope I wasn't being too flip with you, Carl. I mean that quite genuinely, that there's a lot going on here, and it is very helpful to us to have people reading carefully and highlighting that so that we can go back and look at that.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And I can think this is another example of, we are writing these rules for hopefully a long term, and there's going to be a period of transition which is a little bit different. We need to have, I think, give ourselves a little bit more wiggle room over the next few years to make that work.
I see Aaron.
Yeah, just one more point on the performance standards. Matt, you just made the point about maybe we don't need vehicular-based performance standards when we're doing some of this development review. And that's certainly something that local governments have been looking at. I know we've done a lot of work on that at Washington County. But one concern I've raised with these draft rules is that we have a number of ODOT facilities in Washington County, and I know around the state, and a number of our future climate-friendly areas have ODOT facilities running right through them. So the county can do what we have control over with our performance standards, but I'm still really concerned that these draft rules do not apply to ODOT and ODOT's performance standards. So we can end up in a situation where our great new updated performance standards still require motor vehicle enhancements based on ODOT standards. And I hope that the meeting that people left to go to with ODOT addressed some of those concerns, and that that's something that we see more information coming out about in the upcoming weeks.
I'm not sure we did just talk about that. It was a little huddle, Aaron, with ODOT staff, but I don't think we solved everything. So thank you for raising thank you for raising it here.
It's really complicated, and we understand that. We have, particularly in the Portland metro area, but I know in the other MPOs where we have all of these jurisdictions kind of smushed up together with different jurisdictions over the roadways. It just makes it really challenging to implement these rules. And that's some of what we're trying to tease out in doing these reviews. So we know DLCD staff are working really hard to respond to all these questions, but I think that the questions we're asking are just highlighting how many more questions there actually are out there.
Thank you. There's no shortage. Thanks, Aaron. I really appreciate you serving on the RACTRAD and it's way back when, several years ago, expressing your interest so to do. So hopefully you don't regret it, but thank you for serving with us and sharing your expertise.
Just real quick, if I can talk about performance standards and on state highways, that you're correct that ODOT has its performance standards that it uses under the Oregon Highway Plan. ODOT and Metro have been working, Region 1 have been working together in the metropolitan area on looking at some alternatives, and you may be more plugged into that project than I am and where that's going. But on a larger scale, the ODOT is working on the update to the Oregon Transportation Plan right now. Following up on that will be an update to the Oregon Highway Plan. And my understanding is that's something that they're going to look at. Now, I'm not going to sit here and say, oh, they're totally changing everything they're going to do, because I don't know that that's the case. But that's there's talk that something could change there. So I think keeping an eye on that, being plugged into those processes, that's a different state agency. That's not us. We're trying to do our part here.
Bill, do you want to comment just briefly on CFAs and how the 060 would apply in a CFA? And maybe I can throw in another couple acronyms and jargon in there.
So yeah, real quickly, I think one, issue folks have had with performance standards, particularly on state highways, has been around doing like upzonings under 060 and making those work, and sometimes having outcomes which are contrary to what we're really shooting for, particularly in downtown areas and places that might be climate-friendly areas. That was one reason we developed the tool of the mixed-use multimodal area about a decade ago within 060, which allows local governments to have some more flexibility for how they do those analyses in those places. We have a different mechanism that is going around 060 altogether within climate-friendly areas. I don't, the Portland metropolitan area is not going to have climate-friendly areas because of the Region 2040 work and the Region 2040 centers that you already have up there. So in the other 7 metropolitan areas around the state, the climate-friendly areas and how land use changes are reviewed in those places is substantially different than under the existing 060 regime. So I just do want to highlight that piece.
We are at 11:30, so I want to give a final opportunity. Deputy Director Kirsten Green, did you have any final thoughts? And then Commission Chair Robin MacArthur.
Thank you. As Deputy Director Green on, I don't want to talk over her. Excuse me. I think she said she was in listening.
Thank you. Yep. I'm in transit. I apologize. So thanks, Matt. No, just a big thanks to everyone, and to join us again Friday if folks are able. But Chair MacArthur, please.
Thank you, and really a special thanks to everybody. I learned so much from all of you. Your precise questions and your clear articulation of the issues is really invaluable to me as a commission member, and I know it is to staff, and I know they've taken a lot of notes, and we need to get back to you collectively on the answers to your very, very good questions. I hear in all of your questions really a sincerity and a desire to pursue climate-friendly communities and equitable communities. So I hear that loud and clear. And I believe that actually a lot of the plans and actions you have on the ground go a long way to those ends, to those goals. So I don't for 1 minute think that you have a different motive in your questions. I think you're really trying to understand how those questions might work in your communities, and each community has a little bit different way of doing things. So we want to make sure that we answer your questions so that you can go forth once this rule is adopted and implement them in your local jurisdictions in a collective, holistic way and be effective. So, and I was bummed I had to leave this meeting for like 45 minutes for another meeting on this very topic, but it was a parking thing that I was talking to some folks about. So I'm going to go back and listen to these tapes because, again, this was probably for me the best education I have had in the issues of all the RAC meetings that I have sat in on. And it's only understandable given that we're at this critical juncture and we have a draft out there and we have timelines and we have commission meetings set up to go and look at these more specifically. But again, having said all that, it really is meant to say a genuine thanks to each and every one of you for participating today. It's really helpful to me and to staff.
Matt, I think with that, we're adjourned. Thank you, everybody. See you again Friday and ongoing. Appreciate it.